I'm going to spend 15-20 minutes talking about something I don't understand, but nobody else understands it either. And I'm going to talk about things that we've made a few forays into in the last 5-10 years, but we need to be a lot better at. And I'm going to talk about the Coral Triangle. Most of you have seen this map, I think. But a lot of things are going to be happening there in spatial planning in the coming years. A lot of things are happening there now. And there are some issues to do with scale that we really need to work out if we're going to be as effective in our spatial planning decisions as we would like. And when I say spatial planning, I mean not just for conservation of biodiversity, but for fisheries management and livelihoods as well, and balancing all those different objectives. So I'm talking specifically about the mismatch that we often find between regional and local perspectives, and I'm going to define pretty loosely what I mean by regional and local. Regional, well, they both in fact can cover a range of extents. We mean different things by regional. Here's a regional plan for the Sulu-Sulawesi Sea. So it's quite a bit of country in there. And another definition of a region could be something more familiar, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. That's a pretty big region. Or it could be something like Kimby Bay. This is work by TNC. Spatial planning there recently. So the important thing about regional is it gives us context, spatial context for local decisions. And so local could be a range of things too, but local is the extents over which we apply particular management actions. So they're going to be smaller than regions for the most part, but ranging in size from the green zones in the GBR, the no-take areas. Just Gary's experience, so I'm a bit wary of using this thing. So here's a sequence you can see from software outputs at the top to draft green zones to final green zones. So we can think of that as, and you can see the scale here is fairly large. It's about 60 k's, I think. So we're talking about fairly large actions in this case. That's not always the case. Here's some of the areas. This is one of the areas of interest that came out of that Kimby Bay exercise. And what you can see in here are some very small areas. Here's 6 kilometres of managed areas, some of them no-take zones. Gary talked to us about the Philippines. Here's one of the islands in the Philippines where Rebecca, his PhD student, worked. And for comparison here, we've got in the background that the green polygon is an average size no-take from the Great Barrier Reef, superimposed on that island. And what we have in this island is municipalities, barangays, which are the finest textured management units on the island. And those little areas can each set up their own MPAs, and many of those end up being very small. So the important thing about regional and local is that even though they vary in extents, there is usually a big mismatch between the regional scale and the local scale. And while we have that mismatch, both regional designs and local scale actions have pros and cons, and they turn out to be complementary. So what regional designs, 3 big advantages can give us. They can give us spatial context for our individual actions, our decisions, because they allow us to see connectivity and complementarity between areas. They can lay out a big picture and allow us to resolve spatial and temporal options for management. When do we do things? Maybe how do we resolve spatial options? Can we move away from that area if it's difficult and find a replacement for it? Those kinds of questions. And they allow us to merge our designs with other big picture initiatives, like integrated coastal management plans. The but and it's a big one, is that we've got a pretty poor record of linking our regional designs to local actions. We've become very clever at producing regional designs. We do it in a very sophisticated way. We've developed special purpose software tools. We argue about the finer points of using different kinds of data, and we should, but that sophistication hasn't yet translated into routine transition from regional designs to local actions. If we look at the other side of the coin, local actions are, have big advantages. They're motivated, they're understood, they're supported by the locals. And Gary gave us an example on Apo Island. They're informed by detailed local information that we cannot get consistently across whole regions. The downsides, they tend to form collections, not systems, not integrated systems in terms of connectivity or complementarity. And they tend to be very often residual to extractive uses. And what I mean by that is that they're in the places where people don't want to do stuff, and they're not necessarily the places that most need management. So we've got these two perspectives. They don't connect very much. They each have strengths and weaknesses, and clearly it would be good to connect them better. And that's the challenge, and that's what I'm grappling with, and people in my research group are grappling with, and a lot of other people around the world are doing as well. And the Coral Triangle is a very good focus for us to do that, because we have to get this together reasonably soon. So here's an extreme sort of difference in scale, where you've got Sulu-Sulawesi Sea on the left and a very tiny MPA on the right. It's not always that extreme. But what we really have to do is two things. We have to scale up our actions so that they mean something in terms of systems, whatever we define as a system, at a regional scale, and that means changing to some extent what people do locally to make them better coordinated and maybe more extensive in some places than locals would otherwise do. And we need to scale down our designs, and what that means is change as well, because our best laid plans at a regional scale will always need to change as we drill down to the local level and we find that some of our data are wrong. People we thought were going to do business with us don't want to, other people do, and to some extent our regional designs will have to change. So it's all about adapting local decisions upwards and adapting regional decisions downwards. How important is it to do this? We assume it's pretty important. We can't back that up with a lot of data. Here's what we assume. We assume that we should be able to measure some progress towards an objective. There are actually lots of objectives, not just one, of course. We could be talking about representation, about connectivity, about different kinds of connectivity, about fisheries benefits, about lots of things. We could unpack those objectives probably to get to a dozen or so without too much trouble. And each one of them would need to be looked at in this way. And then we're assuming that as MPAs build out in either an uncoordinated or a coordinated way, we get different outputs. So we're assuming that often, but without design, we would end up having fewer benefits, however we measured those, than with design. But there are precious few studies for us to back that up. And it's tractable, but not many people are doing it. And if we find that there's a big difference between the blue line and the red line, then we're justified in spending quite a lot of time and effort on this. If the difference is big, then what we're saying is design actually doesn't matter too much. You go and make lots of ad hoc decisions and you'll just about get to the same place. Intuitively, that doesn't seem to stack up. We've done a little bit of this quantitatively in the terrestrial scene, but not much in the marine scene. So that's something for us to deal with. So I've got 4 sets of questions now, and then I'll just finish with those, and I'm not suggesting that these are intractable. For a minute, I'm going to suggest that these are important for us to deal with, and to some extent we are dealing with them, but there are lots that need attention. And they come under four categories. There's conceptual ones, there's operational ones, there's policy questions, and there's institutional questions. And these are just some of them because it would be tedious to go through them all. So for scaling up, we need to think about how do we actually think about local ad hoc decisions? Are they things that get in the way? Do they make our job harder down the track? Because you're inheriting lots of uncoordinated decisions that have to be, that develop their own momentum, they get locked in, and then we have to build on those, and the longer they go, the harder it is to build them into a system. That's one approach, and that's one way of thinking about it, but an alternative would be to balance that out, is that ad hoc local actions actually seed a lot of goodwill and a lot of, and actually help build the momentum for the whole idea of managing areas as closed or temporary, permanent or temporary closures. Probably both is true, but we need to think about that. Scaling down, if regional designs have to change on an ongoing basis to accommodate new data and other surprises and mistakes, then how do we think about designs? They can't be static, and I've thrown in a quote here that I quite like from Dwight Eisenhower, that plans are useless but planning is indispensable. And there are different ways of interpreting that, I guess, but my interpretation is that a static plan becomes useless fairly quickly, but a planning process, the process of updating plans and making them continually relevant as they incorporate changes, is a very effective way to go, because what it means is that at any one time you've got the best picture you can come up with of how you need to invest in fisheries or conservation. A few operational questions. There are lots of these, so I've cut these down just to a couple in each category. For scaling up, how do we develop decision support tools to help local communities coordinate their actions? We've got decision support tools out there. They tend to be used by first world people doing mostly regional designs. Are they the same tools that we would make available to people, to communities in the Philippines or the Solomons or PNG or somewhere else to scale up their actions? Maybe, but maybe we need to sit down and think through exactly what the requirements are and maybe build some new tools from scratch. What do we do about data gaps? Because at the finer scale, as you drill down, you find lots of holes in your data, and you find that your regional data don't always stand up to scrutiny. And how different, if we coordinate local actions upwards, how different do they end up being from regional scale designs? And what does that mean for us? What do we gain and lose? For scaling down, similar, this question is the mirror, I suppose, the reverse of the previous dot point, is that if we are adjusting our regional designs constantly to local circumstances, what do we gain and lose? I mean, what we gain, obviously, is relevance, and that's a big thing, but maybe we lose something as well. When are regional scale data simply not worth using? Because a lot of our regional scale data are highly generalised and actually serve as surrogates for the things that we really care about. And to some extent, if they are really generalised, coarse resolution, and they're not good surrogates, they might actually be pointing us in the wrong places. And we have to think about when that might be the case. Another example is to do with mainstreaming. And mainstreaming is taking a design out of a technical process, even one that excuse me, involves stakeholders to a large extent, taking technical products and interpreting those for a whole range of sectors. And they could be fisheries, could be logging, government, local government, state government, provincial government, and others. And interpreting your designs in ways that mean something to those people in their day-to-day activities. How do we do that if we're going to say every 6 months we've got a new design, which is probably the reality if our designs are going to be relevant. Some policy questions. What we're saying with scaling up is that it's good that people are out there doing things spontaneously in an ad hoc way, thinking about their municipality or their local community. But scaling up involves, as well as all the coordination activities, it involves asking people to do things that they would not otherwise do spontaneously, and it might be asking them to do something to move what they're doing, to focus on a different habitat or a different example of that habitat. It might mean changing location. It might mean, probably does mean, asking them to do things more extensively than they would otherwise do. So an example from Fiji is that if we, Marina Mills, who's a co-author on this talk, as part of her PhD, is modelling the likely expansion of closures, community-based closures in traditional fishing grounds in Fiji, and that gives us a spatial idea of where they're likely to expand. But the other side of that is that it's very unlikely that communities will expand those of their own accord to meet national goals, which is 30% of each of the inshore major habitats. And given that, what do we do? How do we motivate people to do those things, and probably to forgo, at least in the short term, more than they would be prepared to forgo. Scaling down, decision makers like to think of conservation plans as solutions, final solutions. They like to think that once you've been through this process, lots of money, lots of people, that you've actually nailed it and we can move on. But that's not actually the case. And how do we sell the idea of dynamic designs to the general public and other stakeholders who might be antagonistic, while still retaining our scientific credibility? Yep, that was a really good plan we did, but now that was 6 months ago. This is a different one, and there may be some really good reasons for saying that. There are some really good reasons for saying that, but we have to be careful of the way we market that sort of idea. And the final one, some institutional questions. How do we establish institutions for effective coordination of local actions? And that's not a complete mystery, because some people are doing it in various places, although we still have a lot to learn about what works and what doesn't, and where it works and where it doesn't. And what sort of, under different social and political situations, what sort of spatial limits are there? How many communities can you get together and effectively coordinate with a certain governance system? Or how many municipalities can you actually coordinate? We have some things to learn there too. And then scaling down, if it's true, and it is, that regional plans have to keep evolving through time, that you don't just do them, sign them off, put them on a shelf, then who will take responsibility for managing those through time? That's actually a difficult question, and when you ask it, you don't see lots of agencies and NGOs sticking their hands up, because they're not used to 10 or 20 year timeframes with a commitment to a particular kind of approach, even though that approach would evolve through time. And a final one is what sort of protocols related to that. If we have a planning system where people are managing data, big lots of data, and making decisions involving stakeholders, running analyses, who's responsible for doing that into the future, and who can make those calls? Who can say what data are useful, what data are not, how they're analysed, and when a design has to change? Do we bring the stakeholders back in? We don't know, because we haven't thought a lot about it. So they're just some of the questions we have to deal with. And just back to the Coral Triangle, there are lots of challenges, and they span the spectrum from the finer points of modelling and data and ecological theory all the way through to understanding governance systems. And as I said at the outset, I'm not saying this is intractable, I'm saying we need to get on with it. And the Coral Triangle is a great example of why we need to get on with it, because spatial management is needed, and we're trying it, and we need to get better at what we're doing. So it's true to say that if we don't sort this out in the next 5 years or so, then probably a lot of money is going to be wasted in the Coral Triangle at both ends of the scales, and will be much less effective than we might otherwise have been. Thanks.